Hello, my name is Heidi Matson, and I'm a discussion group coordinator and a member of the Student Advisory Board at the Dole Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program. Discussion groups are made possible by the Newman's Own Foundation, and we'd like to thank the Dolph Simons Family Fund for sponsoring Jerry's residency. Today's program will be live streamed and available on our YouTube channel. We are also excited that C-SPAN is recording this session. You can also access all past Dole Institute programs by visiting our YouTube channel anytime. After the program, we will have some time for audience questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. For virtual viewers, please send your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. Please ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming our Fall Fellow, Jerry Seib.
Okay, Heidi, so I'm thinking, did I turn off my cell phone? Yeah, I did, okay. Thank you all for being here. It's nice to have you all here. We're going to talk today about political polarization, which I think is the subject that hangs over every conversation in Washington, where I usually am, and here in Kansas and everywhere else, both about politics and about governance. It's a huge issue. President Santos, the former president of Colombia, the Nobel Peace Laureate, was here last night. He said that political polarization, not just in this country, but around the democratic world, is maybe the biggest threat to democracy, and we have to figure out how to come to grips with it and how to reduce it. So that's what we'll be talking about today. I'm really happy to have two great people here to discuss this subject. Neil Newhouse is a partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies, a national political and public research firm, one that used to do polling for us at the Wall Street Journal for years and years, so I've known Neil for a long time. He's done dozens of House, Senate, gubernatorial races, served as a pollster for 4 presidential campaigns, including 2 of Senator Dole's, if I remember right. 1.5, maybe.
Depends on how you count it.
And was the chief pollster for Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign. Neil's been named Pollster of the Year by the American Association of Political Consultants 3 times. Maybe more important than all that, he's from Shawnee Mission, Kansas.
Yep.
So he grew up just down the road. And if you want to know, if you want proof of that, you can look at his Twitter handle, which I think is KC Kid.
It is.
Interestingly, he's also a graduate of Duke University, which will put him in an interesting spot for Football Saturday this week.
I mean, I'll just settle it right now. Okay, I am a KU fan. I love KU, but my alma mater takes precedence. But whenever they're not playing Duke, I'm for KU.
All right, fair enough. You'll notice that there is not Joel Benenson.
Really?
We upgraded.
Hardly.
So Joel suffered a fall in his hometown of New York yesterday, hurt his back, and was told by a doctor, do not get on an airplane. So Governor Sebelius, who you all know, graciously agreed to step in, and thank you for that very much. So give it up for Governor Sebelius for being here. Kathleen Sebelius.
And I like KU all the time.
See, you lost the crowd already, Neil. Sorry.
I know. Okay,
you know the story. Kathleen is twice elected governor of Kansas. As she pointed out to me a couple of weeks ago, she is one of 3 Democratic women who've been elected governor of Kansas, and that makes this the only state that has that distinction. Subsequently, she was appointed by President Obama as the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, which is a really easy job. And prior to that, she was Kansas Insurance Commissioner and served in the state legislature. So as a result, we have a conversation here that is simultaneously national, bipartisan, and of Kansas. So that's awesome. Our topic is political polarization, as I said, and we also want to talk about how it might affect the 2022 vote. But first I want to talk about how we got here. Polarization seems to be the backdrop of everything. We seem to be a country that is not only evenly divided between the 2 countries, but bitterly divided between the 2 countries. Let me ask each of you to talk a little bit about how we got here before we talk about where we go from here. Neil, why don't you start?
Yeah, it didn't start with Trump. I'm interested in what you would think, but I think it goes back to the Bill Clinton era and when Newt Gingrich pushed to impeach Bill Clinton. And it began to kind of polarize the country. What was really interesting back then was President Clinton's approval rate numbers were really not very high. After he got impeached, as he's going through the impeachment process, his approval ratings went up. Mm-hmm. And they went, and I would talk to Republican audiences and do my my usual presentation, and people would ask me, I said, what? They'd ask, who the heck are you polling anyway? Because there's no way his approval rating can go up while he's being impeached. And the answer was, to me, obvious. When Republicans attack Democrats, Democrats rally around their candidate, and it was Democratic voters who weren't wild about Bill Clinton, but they're coming to his defense. When Republicans attack Democrats, Democrats rally around their candidate. When Democrats attack Republicans, Republicans rally around their candidates. And you began to see that not just at election time, but throughout a legislative session and during all points in time during a cycle. I would always look at numbers. We'd track a race. We'd poll in a campaign. And we'd be in March of an election year. And generally, we'd have a large number of undecideds. Republicans really weren't decided who they're going to vote for. Democrats weren't. And this was 2 decades ago. And now, if you poll in March of an election year, the Republican candidates winning 90% of the Republican vote, Democratic candidates winning 89% of the Democratic vote, and there are no undecideds, or at least there's nobody in the middle. It is that kind of polarization that has really intensified over the past 20 years as a result of not just the campaigns we're running, but the fact that there's nobody in Congress who's crossing over and crossing party lines right now.
Governor Sebelius?
I clearly am more of a practitioner, not a pollster, so I don't have the kind of data lens that Neil has. I go back to my own personal experience. So both my father and my father-in-law were in politics. Mm-hmm. We got married in 1974, and they did not know each other. And frankly, Gary and I were a little worried about that because one was a very liberal Democrat and one was a pretty conservative Republican. Different states, different. They quickly became great friends. Mm-hmm. They were in the same biz. They, both were in military service, both found public service to be a logical step. They both believed in contributing to the country and told all the same jokes. Keith Sebelius happily told my father at one point a Democrat had never beaten him, and my father said, neither has a Democrat beaten me. So, they shared that in common. But fast forward, the world is remarkably different today. And I think, to me, watching at least this little lens of Kansas, it is about the Clinton era politics, but a different thing happened, I think, in Kansas, or we were ahead of the country, which was this divide that started in the Republican Party, where suddenly there was in 1996 in Kansas, there was a new branch of the Republican Party, and the battle was more ferocious among Republicans, frankly, than it was between Democrats and Republicans. In fact, it gave, in this state, kind of a wide berth to Democrats to make deals in the legislature and run races and win races. And that began then to happen all over the country. And I think the partisanship became much more complicated. It was also tied to, wasn't a broad tent, it became a narrow belief system, and people were exited or asked to exit from their own party registration. Kansas is pretty interesting. I went back 10 years. I thought this was different. We still have approximately the same number of registered Republicans, Independents, and Democrats as we did 10 years ago. That's not like a lot of states. And independents is still a big block of voters where people at least don't want to self-identify with. They may feel themselves to be partisan, but they don't want to self-identify as partisan. And I think that's somewhat different than a lot of places in the country. And those independents do move back and forth. So I do think it has grown, and social media has added to that growth in a tremendous way. And you know, people's self-selection of their fact base has added to that in a tremendous way. But in the 90s, things began, I think, to really dissolve in a way that we hadn't seen before.
Let me give you another example. And it's not just voters, it's members of Congress. There's, some of you students may recognize National Journal. National Journal is a publication in DC that studies Congress. They used to do a study every year, and they would rank every member of Congress on an ideological scale, most liberal to most conservative. 1982, there were 275 members of Congress that fell between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. So that's the middle. So it's 77, I think it's 77% or so of Congress fell in that middle. In 2015, they redid a study. There were 3 members of Congress that fell in the middle. And you'd think in the Senate it'd be different. There wasn't a single U.S. senator that crossed over that line. It is not, it's, you know, and I totally agree in terms of social media. It's a combination of social media, of redistricting, so that Republicans are running from more redder districts and Democrats are running from bluer districts. And you don't have to appeal to voters in the middle. I mean, it's a combination of all these factors, and it has resulted in this bitter, you know, partisan polarization that, you know, Democrats don't trust Republicans and Republicans don't trust Democrats.
You and Joel have done some work in this space, and I wanted to put up a couple of numbers here. The first one may be the most shocking one, about whether some Americans now think that maybe it'd be better if their states just seceded from the Union. I mean, literally dissolved the Union. And as you will see, 59% of partisans on the Democratic side said that wouldn't be a bad idea for their state, and 77% of partisans on the Republican side.
Yeah, this was 59% of Biden voters and 77% of Trump voters said it'd be better if all blue states, all red states, I mean, this gives you an idea of just the stark intensity of sentiment across party lines that, you know, it's Joel's line, it's as if we're not having a common conversation anymore between, you know, people of different sides in the party.
He gave me that line and you just used it, so
I thought he might.
I had a long conversation with Joel today, and he kept saying, say this, and then say this, and then he and Neil do a lot of programs together.
Interestingly, Republicans and Democrats both think the other guy's a bully. 73% of Democrats think of that of Republicans, 74% of Republicans think that of Democrats. And they think the other guy's untruthful. So, Kathleen, is this, I have 2 questions. First question for you is this dangerous, what we're talking about here? Or is it just an obstacle to good governance? Or is it actually dangerous?
I think it's extremely dangerous. And I would say that these are the intensity of voters. You take a whole group of people, and there's a large group of people, whatever state you're looking at, who have just opted out a while ago, who are not registered, who are not voting, who absolutely have given up on democracy. So added to this is that group who say, you know, participating not only is not my democratic responsibility, but it won't solve anything. It doesn't help anything. It doesn't mean anything, and in fact, it may be counterproductive. So I think the danger is that people not only cannot talk to each other, cannot think about working together. Any kind of compromise is seen as being a traitor. often. You can't cross a line, you can't put together a deal, you can't move anything forward. But the intensity to say, I just, I want you to live someplace else, I want you to be a new country, I want, I'll take up arms, I'll do whatever, is a real danger to the democracy. And I think if we do not have a common set of shared values and facts, I think we're in real trouble. And I mean shared values like, do we believe in an independent judiciary? What does that mean? What about a free press? What about 3 equal branches of government? I mean, those tenets, I think, have not been under scrutiny and question until fairly recently, and I think they're under extreme tension and scrutiny and pressure.
Neil, I had tended to think that the political institutions, particularly in Washington, the House, the Senate, are more polarized than the nation itself, that they were unrepresentative in that sense. Then I see the numbers that you have here, and I think maybe that's not true. So my question for you is the country as polarized and divided as Washington is? Is Washington actually representative of the country?
I think potentially the country is more divided than D.C. And I agree with the governor. I mean, this is extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, these are, when Joel and I did these numbers we did this for University of Chicago, we've added questions on the survey just for the heck of it, just to see what kind of response we get. It scared the shit out of us. I mean, it really did. These are scary numbers. This is, when you talk about potentially democracy being at stake, I don't think that's an understatement.
As you're talking, I'll ask them to flip forward to a set of numbers that I suspect you may have in mind.
Can I throw one thing in here?
Absolutely.
Just about the Congress versus the country. I don't disagree that individuals in their own, hearts and thoughts and minds are getting more and more polarized. I would say that the function of government, I think, is very different in Congress than at the state level. States have to get things done. They have to, at the end of the day, pass a budget. They have to adjourn. They have to move things forward. There are only a few states in the country, Illinois being one, and maybe a handful of others that have defied that. They just can't, they live in some endless monetary morass. But most states actually function, and they literally go from step to step and get things done. Often the governor is not the same party as the legislature. So I do think Congress has a particularly frozen and dysfunctional look to most of the country where, the legislative successes in the last 6 months are pretty remarkable just because there have been so
Washington,
few. Yeah. They're just like, whoa, and people literally across parties.
You know what's interesting about that too is we asked voters, do you think politicians should cross party lines to try to get things done? And everybody, 90% of voters say absolutely they should. And then you ask, okay, do you think your Republican, elected incumbents should cross party lines and compromise their views? And they're like, no.
Never.
The Republicans want the Democrats to compromise, and the Democrats want the Republicans to compromise, and we're still stuck in the middle. And it's still, you have the hard partisans on either side that are just not budging. You do have people in the middle, but people in the middle in politics, independents usually don't voice their concerns. They're relatively quiet about what they believe.
But Governor Sebelius, let's talk about the experience in this state this year, because you actually had a referendum on abortion in which I think everybody, regardless of which side you were on the abortion debate, was surprised at the outcome because the pro-choice forces won by 18 percentage points in a state that Donald Trump carried by 15 percentage points. You had probably 180,000 independents probably showed up to vote.
Right.
Is that a sign that maybe everybody isn't as locked in to their silos as we think, and or that independents can still stand up and take a stand from time to time?
I think it's a couple of things. I think, first of all, people want to be asked about big decisions. And this was a big decision, and this was a straight-on yes or no vote. And that made it easier than translating through a candidate or lots of different issues. But I think also that the notion that a registration to a party means that you believe X, Y, and Z on these 10 issues is just blown away by this. I mean, the majority of voters in the referendum were Republicans. Even if all of 100% of the Democrats and 100% of the independents who went to the polls on August 2nd voted no, it would have lost. So clearly Republicans are pro-choice, some portion of them. Some portion of Democrats are pro-life, and the independents are all over the board. I think that's true with guns. I think it's true with climate. I think it's true with, finances. So I think party registration often is not the best predictor of what people believe, and they may be believing different things. I mean, they don't necessarily fall into a silo. So I think what this referendum showed is that at the end of the day, Kansans overwhelmingly did not want state legislators to control their reproductive health decisions for themselves or their grandchildren or their daughters, period. They didn't want that to happen.
I think the other thing it showed is that it didn't show that 58% of Kansans are pro-choice. No. What it showed is Kansas wanted to protect their right to make their own decision. And right, to make a decision over their own bodies. And I think that even pro-lifers didn't want to necessarily legislate what other people would do. So I wasn't having grown up in Johnson County, truthfully, I wasn't all that surprised with that final vote. Yeah. Maybe the margin, but not the final vote. Yeah.
But I think, in all due deference, you might not have been surprised by the no prevailing. I was blown away, and maybe you were more prescient than I was, but about the turnout and the numbers and the registration. And the fact that people were on fire. And we talked about this earlier. Ohio right now, which does not have a ballot initiative on the ballot, women are out registering men by a margin of 12 points. The new registrations in women post-Dobbs has just gone off the chart. It's happening in So I think that the Dobbs decision has ignited a fire, and it's not just in Kansas. I mean, it's easier to see. We had a vote 6 weeks after the Dobbs decision, but I think you're going to see it play out in November in a meaningful way in terms of engaging some of those folks who just have said, nothing really matters, I'm not going to vote. They're suddenly finding that this matters and they're going to vote.
Regardless of I think what happens in November, whether Republicans win the House, win the Senate, or whatever happens, we're going to look back on this election a decade from now, 2 decades now, as the Dobbs election. This is going to be the Dobbs midterm. This is what defines this election this year. It's not it defines the election. It's not the number one issue. Number one issue is cost of living, inflation, but the Dobbs decision more than anything else defines what this election is about.
Well, and women turned out, and young people, I mean, the groups that are marginal or regarded as maybe they won't show up this time. Youth vote, the under 30 vote was off the charts. Latino vote in this state was off the chart. I mean, categories of voters who are often regarded, certainly in the midterms, as unlikely voters were very much present in the amendment vote.
I want to talk about 2 things. First, about the nature of the civil discourse in the country, and second, what we might do to improve both the civil discourse and the polarization within the infrastructure. We sit here in the Dole Institute, which stands for both bipartisanship, which I hope we're displaying today, as well as civil conversation. But Neil, in the work that you and Joel have done, there seems to be a real breakdown in the civil conversation. I mean, I think you found that 49% of people said that they have avoided political conversations with other people they know because they just don't want to have that unpleasant conversation. And maybe most shocking, 28% of people said it may be necessary at some point soon for citizens to take up arms against the government. Now, maybe people are saying that for shock value, but how do you interpret those kind of numbers?
And the other numbers we showed, a plurality of Americans believe it's possible to have a civil war in the next 10 years. These are scary numbers. I mean, it is, And I think it's being fueled not just by the politics, but truthfully, Jerry, I think it's being fueled by the media, by the niche media that we're all, subjected to. I mean, when you're growing up, it was CBS, ABC, NBC, and that was all you had. And now all Republicans listen to is Fox, all Democrats listen to is, MS or CNN, which has changed dramatically in the past decade. You're getting siloed information that is self-fulfilling to reinforce what you already believe. And I think that's playing a huge role in this. These are scary numbers. The fact that take up arms against the government, it's not just Republicans. Republicans are like 34%. Democrats are at 20%. My favorite group, NPR listeners, 24% of NPR listeners say it may be time to take up arms against the government. These are ridiculous numbers. Yeah. And I think it's just another measure that our democracy is facing a real challenge right now.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Well, we just watched on January 6th, people take up arms against the government. Yeah. I mean, this is not a hypothetical. Yeah. We watch people, I never thought I would see it in my lifetime, storm, the United States Capitol, desecrate a building. I mean, people died. And so it's very real and very scary. And I would agree with Neil that it's not just, I don't think political parties necessarily are driving this. I do think the media contributes, and it's the 24/7 cycles that has to create conflict and has to create, shock value, or they get tuned out. And it also is social media, which has no regulations at all about information and disinformation and misinformation. They are not accountable. And I do believe that is a piece of this puzzle that regulators are going to have to look at very, very seriously, because a lot of information and misinformation and disinformation is driven through channels that are really outside of the purview of any kind of regulatory control. And I think that adds to just a tumultuous feeling in the country that you're on the edge, and any moment you may fall over, and you better get a gun and you better protect yourself, because they're coming for you, whoever they are.
So if that's the backdrop, how do we change the conversation? Thoughts about how we, as a country, create a better climate to have conversations that aren't so fraught about politics and even about culture?
Go ahead. Jump right in there.
When Joe and I answer this question, there isn't an easy way out. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I really do. I think you need a new political leadership in the tops of both parties, and new candidates running. Right now, I don't see it getting done. It's going to be a decade before we get through this.
I think the only thing that gives me, first of all, I'm a Democrat from Kansas, so I'm always optimistic. You have to be optimistic if you continue to register that way. But I was in college in the late 60s in Washington, D.C. And we really sort of were on the edge of the earth. I mean, every weekend was spent with peace marches. There was a war underway, and I remember the first lottery when watching my brother's numbers be drawn. One was 32 and the other was 16. Ooh. And we had a president who had lost the faith, at least in the younger generation, who was running a war that people didn't believe in, at least the younger generation. We were on the edges in D.C. We were still living in the burned remains of the riots that had followed the assassination of Martin Luther King. Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. I mean, so I look at that as a time where I did feel the country was unraveling, where generations were at battle with one another. I remember the National Guard troop in my home state of Ohio that was sent to Kent State and killed students. These young National Guard soldiers were told to fire on protesting students and killed 4 of them. And I remember campaigning a couple of months later. My father was running for governor. He was not the governor who sent the troops in. And there were people in union halls who said to me, I would have shot more of them. I wish we had shot more. I wish they had been better shots, because and there were enemies within families. There were enemies on. So I only put that as a backdrop to say there have been some really hard times before, and we have pulled out of it. Now, we didn't have 24/7 news media. We didn't have social media. We didn't have this level. But I do think starting some civics conversations very early on, and having a better understanding, particularly of younger people, in how critical it is that they participate. I've been alarmed for years that the number of people who just choose not to register is growing. That should have been an alarm bell 10 years ago. I mean, we leave 1 million votes on the table here in Kansas. They just don't participate. And so we've got a problem, I think, that's systemic and has to start at a very young age to, make Election Day a day off, get people engaged and involved. I'm all for a year of service of all kinds, military service, not-for-profit service, other kinds of service, to really engage young people as they graduate from high school, and the fact that this is your country. Service is a part of the rent you pay for living in a democracy. Some elements like that, I think, could be really helpful, and not in a partisan way. I mean, just to say, you gotta own up and step up and be part of this, and then run for office, or get involved in a campaign, or be a part of your town council.
One of the most encouraging things I've seen lately is the increase in turnout.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, it's across the board. I think we're going to see a higher turnout in this midterm
it's now
election.
multiple cycles in a row.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's going to continue, hopefully. I mean, and that's good for the
And
city.
that includes young voter turnout.
Yeah, absolutely.
Consistently high the last 3 cycles, 4 cycles now.
But if you actually look at the data and look at the presidential elections, 18 to 29-year-olds comprise a larger proportion of the electorate than senior citizens. 18 to 29-year-olds. And it should be even bigger if they'd actually come out and vote. But those are amazing numbers.
And we need some of the octogenarians to get the hell out of office. They are too old. They need to exit the stage. You said it. I mean, it's like, oh my heavens, because if there's not
Anybody
a
you have in
pipeline-
mind in particular?
I have a lot. I could make a long list. But, I'm a big believer in passing the baton. This is a relay race, and there are people who have, just blocked the channel for a while, and they need to move on.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about something that each of you mentioned in passing earlier, because I think it's really important, which is structural problems that get in the way of bipartisanship and compromise, particularly in Washington, maybe even at the state level. And Governor, you can talk about that a little bit. But people ask me this all the time: what can we do to fix the polarization in Washington? And I always start with redistricting. We have created a system in which the incentive is to talk only to your side, and the only danger you face in job security terms is in making a compromise with the other side and making your base angry. So redistricting reform, maybe primary reforms in which things like jungle primaries, where you don't run as a partisan in a primary, but just run as a candidate. Let me ask each of you,
Maybe
do those
ranked choice voting.
Ranked choice voting.
do those systemic changes carry some potential here?
Well, I do think the system itself has to be changed, and I'm worried that it's getting more and more locked in, and reapportionment is a big part of it. We just saw reapportionment occur. You've got a Supreme Court who said partisan gerrymandering is fine. That's pretty alarming, and unless it's extreme racial gerrymandering, that's fine too. Well, if that's the law of the land, and you have a dominant party who draws whatever maps they want, regardless of whether it's representative of the voting population, that's a system that is ripe for a lot of tumult, and either people dropping out or people taking up. I mean, the less representative represented people feel when they go to vote, the less they're going to vote, and the less they're going to feel that that's an alternative. And so I do think it's a very serious problem, and it's now been locked in for maybe another 10 years. I live in Lawrence, Kansas, and I'm now part of the 1st District. Hardly a community of interest, although my name is Sebelius, and there is a Sebelius Lake in Norton County. I guess that gives me some tie. But, you know, it was clearly done as a way to gerrymander some more congressional districts here. And it's just disheartening and discouraging to watch it happen.
Well, and even in states like Ohio that passed a redistricting, reform,
Yeah.
it went to the courts, and they pushed through, a Republican plan anyway, and that did the same thing that the law was trying to fix. I think legislatures are still going to do their redistricting the way they've done it. They're still going to gerrymander. I kind of like the idea of the ranked choice voting. I don't like the jungle primaries as much, but ranked choice voting.
Maybe you should define those terms.
A ranked choice voting is when you go in the polls and you have maybe 3 candidates running, or 4 candidates running, and you rank them 1, 2, 3, 4. And then, they're tallied based on not just your first choice, but your second choice. If somebody doesn't get 50%, they look at the second choices, and they keep going until somebody hits.
And they divide up the lower numbers.
Yeah. We did the polling in the New York City mayor's race on this, and they had ranked choice voting. It was fascinating. But here's what's interesting about it. It changes the way you campaign. Mm-hmm. As a practitioner, I've been doing campaigns. My first campaign I ran was 1976. And, every campaign you do contrast advertising, the kind of stuff that you guys probably don't like, but the way most voters make their decisions, between differences between candidates. When you have ranked choice voting, people who don't like a single candidate may not give that candidate their second choice or third choice. And so it encourages campaigns to be more positive. And the less negative you are and the more positive you are in a campaign, the less polarizing the campaign is, and the less polarizing voters become as a result. I think it's something that it's an interesting idea to take a look at, but I think and I'm as guilty as anybody else of recommending negative advertising and that kind of stuff because it works, it moves voters, it helps me win elections. If it doesn't help me win elections, I'm not going to do it. And so if you do the ranked choice voting, potentially you change the way campaigns are run. And I think it's worth looking at.
And why don't you like jungle primaries?
Because it's not supportive of the two-party system. California could have 2 Democrats running against each other rather than a Republican.
And by the way, jungle primaries where everybody runs in the same primary regardless of party identification.
Yeah.
And your argument, I assume, would be that our system works best when there are 2 healthy parties.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so I like I've seen the ranked choice voting thing in action. You saw Sarah Palin lost in Alaska as a result of that. Okay. It may help us long-term elect more candidates who are maybe more representative of their constituencies.
So, Governor Sebelius, your experience here is perhaps instructive. You couldn't have been elected twice in the state unless you talked to Republicans and connected with Republicans. So what's the secret? What's the secret sauce there that politicians can use to do that?
I don't think there is any secret sauce, and I think it's, we are so, in some ways, schizophrenic in Kansas about statewide offices. So Democrats can elect governors and attorneys general and treasurers and other folks, but national Democrats, we can't elect a United States senator. There's something about sending a Kansan to Washington that they disappear into the ether, and they're very nervous about that. And I had people say to me all the time, "Are you one of those national Democrats?" And I would say, "I don't even know what that means exactly. I'm here, I'm in Kansas, I'm staying in Kansas." I do think it's about, people having a eventually a body of work that can counter the whatever tag people are trying to put on them, and that's very helpful. I think having people like you is helpful. I was always, benefited when I started running statewide. The first 2 races were insurance commissioner. My married name definitely helped because Keith was a very popular Republican. And I remember the first time I went out west to some farm show, and people would look at my name tag and say, related to Keith? Yeah, related to Keith. Finally, some guy said to me, so how's Keith? I said, no complaints. And this kid who was with me said, isn't he dead? I said, yeah, but I don't need to be the one to deliver the news, but it was this, so I got, some lift from that. But I think it's about talking to people and listening to people and having people understand that you care more about them than you do about yourself and what's going on. You're listening to them and identify with issues. In this state, education and choice, and it became, some issues around climate and clean energy brought Republicans to the Democratic side. Those were the issues and economic development. I mean, you had to be perceived as a pro-business Democrat. That didn't mean anti-labor. It just was, you were interested in both. But people would cross the aisle based on your views on those issues.
Let me give you another example that parallels Kathleen's, which is, I used to do a ton of work in Massachusetts for Republican governors. Mitt Romney, Charlie Baker, Bill Weld, Paul Cellucci, all elected in a strong Democratic state. Bill Weld ran for U.S. Senate. So he was a very popular governor, ran for U.S. Senate against John Kerry. And Bill Weld's favorability numbers were better than Kerry's. They liked him more. And on the ballot test, we asked, why are you voting for Kerry rather than Weld? What are your hesitations about Bill Weld? Hesitations about sending a Republican to Congress was, quote, he had to work with Mitch McConnell. He had to be, there is such a perception, and I'm sure the same thing is true in Kansas, that when you send somebody like that, they are beholden to the party. And so even though Bill Weld wasn't a hardcore Republican in Massachusetts, they thought if he went to Washington, he'd be sucked in. And the same thing with electing a Democrat.
I think that's right.
Yeah, the same thing. It'll be Chuck Schumer and it's like, oh no, whoever we're going to send there, I know you've been independent as doing this, but when you go to Washington, you're going to toe the party line.
That's interesting.
So let's talk, and by the way, Governor Sebelius has about 5 more minutes because she has to duck out a little early. But let me ask you both to talk a little bit about how the climate we've been discussing will affect this year's voting. How many independent voters are there really out there, Neil? How many swing states are there really in this incredibly polarized red versus blue, everybody's in their team jersey environment? How much surprise might we be in for?
Yeah. Let me just start off by saying I'm still not certain how much you can trust the public polling. And this comes to the pollster. Guys, I mean, I know 2 of my associates were on here last week, Tony and Anzalone, and I mean, Donald Trump spent the last 5 years just beating the living snot out of polls and pollsters, saying that that you can't trust them, they're lying, and they've got an agenda. Well, guess what? His supporters don't want to answer our damn surveys. And we're having really a tough time getting some of those voters to answer it. But who does want to answer it? Anybody who's pro-choice and like these new women registered voters. I mean, you have to control for that kind of stuff when you do polling, and it's really tough. So if you're looking for redemption of the polling industry in 2022, I'm not sure, you may be waiting a little bit longer. Independent voters are, usually midterm elections are base elections. You turn out your base. This year you're going to have a high turnout. Independents are going to come. Independents decide elections. I mean, any Republican running is going to get 85 to 95% of the Republican vote. Same thing on the Democratic side. Independents decide the race. And usually it's independent men going Republican, independent women going Democrat.
And what share of the electorate do you consider to be actually independent?
Actually, independent was about 12 to 15.
So everything is decided in the margins.
Yeah, it's all the margins. It's all by a couple of points. And you've got all these states right now that are within a few points on the statewide ballots. They're going to come down to the end. And usually in midterm elections, elections like that swing one way or the other. I could see what I would call a split-level election, which is, I think Republicans are going to win the House. I mean, it's just based on the redistricting, based on the races that are up, the campaigns. House races don't take on a personality as much as Senate and governor's races do. I think Republicans are going to win the House, and you may have Democrats retain control of the Senate. I don't know, but I could foresee that result. And part of it is, you look at candidate quality. We're not, we put up some candidates that might not have been the best nominees for the party. They still may win, which is even scarier maybe, but it's going to be a tight election. We're not going to know who controls the Senate on election night. So if you don't promise to stay up until you figure it out, because we're not going to figure it out that night.
Kathleen?
Well, I don't disagree that polling hasn't been great in the last number.
I can say that, Kathleen.
I know. I'm happy to pile on. So I think that's, polls are not necessarily predictors. I do think there'll be some surprises, and the numbers are so close in the House, and as Neil said, the races are so tight. The U.S. House is likely to be flipped, and that would not be a surprise. I don't think it's going to be some giant tsunami. I think it could be a fairly narrowly split House. I don't know. Senate, I think, they're not only did the Republicans nominate some candidates who aren't good for the party, they're not good for the country. And I think that the quality of candidates matters. The dialogue matters. So I think there'll be some Dobbs effect that we don't know how to calculate quite yet. We don't know what that's going to do to turnout. We don't know what it's going to do to people's priorities and how they look at the election. It may translate more at the state level than it does at the national level. I mean, it's a little hard to tell. But I think this election will have some surprises and not be, 6 months ago, the standard notion was tsunami for Republicans. It's going to be a shellacking, as Barack Obama liked to call the 2010 election. And that is not what we're going to look at, I don't think. And I think whatever happens will have an impact clearly on 24, both in terms of candidate selection. In many ways, Donald Trump is on the ballot in many of these states with hand-chosen candidates. And if those candidates prevail, God help us all, if some of them lose, I think that will begin to reformat where the Republicans go for leadership in 2024. So it's got some domino effects on the Republican side particularly that I think will be really interesting to play out.
It's also interesting to think about is, okay, let's assume Republicans win the House, lose the Senate. What's that mean for Joe Biden?
Yeah, well.
Because I think the worst thing that happened to Biden in the 2020 election was that he won the Senate. Yeah. Because it did.
There's some people in Biden world who would agree with you on that too.
Yeah, I mean, because they have complete control. And so when you have complete control, you got to get stuff done. Then they waited to the last month to get things done, and they in the process they showed every bad side of the party and everything.
Having
skin in the game
and been a governor with Joe Manchin, it's a very interesting place to be where the fate of the world lies in the hands of Joe Manchin. Let me just end on that.
Thank you very much, Governor Sebelius. So I've got one more question for Neil, and then we're going to open it up to you for questions. Last one word we haven't mentioned here tonight, and I think it's relevant to the polarization argument, is populist. Populism is a flexible term, but it feels like we're in a populist moment right now in this country, which is probably adding to the raw nature of the conversation. Has the populist trend peaked, or are we in the middle of it, or are we on the downturn?
I don't know, and I'm not even sure how we define populism, but I'm reminded of a focus group we were doing in 2016 in New Hampshire. And this was when I was working for Jeb Bush's super PAC. And we're trying to figure out how to get voters to move off of Donald Trump and on to Jeb Bush. And we're presenting them with all this information. And we had two of the voters in the group who were really undecided who to vote for. They couldn't figure out whether they should be voting for Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders. I'm like...
These were confused people.
No, they're not confused. I mean, and they came at, it's almost like they're so extreme they met at the other end. Yeah. I mean, it was, and there's something about that message.
Well, the similarity in the Trump and Bernie Sanders message is, stick it to the man. Whoever the man is, that's a common theme. And voters have been told in billions of dollars of campaign ads over the years that the system is broken and corrupt and you ought to go bust it up. So maybe that's not as surprising as it sounds.
No, it may not be. And the other data we Joe and I did, a majority of Americans think the system is corrupt and working against them. I mean, in terms of the economic system, the political system, and it's not African Americans and Hispanics, it's whites. Yeah. And it's white, low education. What's really interesting is I updated some data the other day. Since 2012, I did Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012. 2012, the Republican Party was dominated by higher educated white voters. Mm-hmm. And now it is dominated by low-ed white voters. I mean, the shift in a decade has been extraordinary. And I would never have dreamed something like that could happen.
Well, socioeconomic terms, the two parties have almost changed places.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I want to open up to you. We'll have two microphones, Heidi and Will, and people who, and Will, I'm going to ask you to do this again. People who are watching on YouTube can send in questions by emailing, help me.
dolequestions@ku.edu. So DOLE questions@ku.edu.
dolequestions@ku.edu. For those of you in the audience, raise your hand. I'll call on you.
Stand up.
Stand up. Thank you very much for the C-SPAN audience. A reminder that a question is actually a question and not a speech, and it has a question mark at the end. So keep that in mind. So who wants to start? Okay, right here.
So something that's been on my mind as you all have been talking is there's a big leaning in the intelligence community that China might do something with Taiwan. This sounds kind of out of the blue. And that might draw the U.S. into some sort of peer-to-peer war with China, possibly Russia and North Korea as well. Do you think that the two parties could figure out how to call time and start working together in that scenario, or would they see that as an opportunity for gamesmanship and polarize even further?
Interesting question and a good question. I think in that kind of circumstance, the parties would pull together. If there's anything that unites all voters, when we test our surveys, is somebody taking a strong stand against China. So that unites voters. That's a no-brainer. I think they would pull together on that. And that would be, that is something, an outside event like that could pull Americans together, like 9/11 did. So, yeah.
And by the way, just I would add, we're having a trial run of that idea right now in Ukraine, which has actually not been a source of partisan disagreement. And I remind people that one of the things that held bipartisanship together for 40 or 50 years in this country was the Cold War, the idea that there was a common enemy that everybody needed to unite against, which was in that case the Soviet Union and communism. And when that went away, the glue that held the two parties together to some extent dried up and blew away. So it's a good question. Right back there.
You talked about the parties distrusting each other, how neither party seems to believe what the other is saying. Where do you think this culture of mistrust between the parties started?
Well, the flip answer would be Fox News and MSNBC, but I mean, it goes back to how campaigns are run to some extent, how campaigns are run and how you divide the electorate and try to polarize people in order to win elections. Newt Gingrich used to talk about wedge issues, a wedge issue where it divides the voters 60-40 and you're on the 60 side of it and you push it through and it generates heat on either side of the argument. And that's what many politicians and campaigns are used to doing. Our candidates understand that you're not going to win. An election is not unanimous. You're not going to get every vote. And so you're geared toward winning 50% plus one, and you dice up the electorate so that you hit just above that number. And if you get half the people, a little over half the people to love you, it doesn't matter if the other half hates you. And so a lot of it has to do with the campaigns we run.
Which doesn't help in governing after the election's over, though.
No, and it used to be, I was the chief of staff for a congressman back in, forever, 77. And a lot of his buddies were Democrats. They'd hang out in the gym, they'd work out together, and now you don't see that kind of stuff anymore. I mean, we were just looking at Bob Dole's phone downstairs in the basement here in the archives, and number one or two on speed dial was Ted Kennedy, and number 4 was George Mitchell. It's like that doesn't happen nowadays.
Yeah. I'll just interject that John Harwood, a friend of mine, when we were working on a book a few years ago, had a dinner with John Dingell, who served in the House longer than any human being ever, more than half a century, a Democrat from Michigan. And he said that when I came to Congress, which would have been in the 50s, people saw their role in the following way. First, they were from a state. Second of all, they represented an institution, the House or the Senate. And third, they represented a party. And what's happened over my career is that those were flipped. Now you represent a party, then you represent an institution, and only lastly do you represent your state. So not healthy, I would say. Who else? Right there.
Yeah, you mentioned that the education demographics have almost flipped between Republicans and Democrats, and I'm wondering if you can say more about that. That's new to me. Why did that happen?
It didn't start with Trump. I think he accelerated the movement, but we began to see that even after the Romney election. I'm not, I can't pinpoint exactly why it happened, but even let me give one more example. The New York Times came out with a poll, I think this past Sunday, and asked, which party do you think is better described by these phrases? And which party is a party for the working class? Republicans and Democrats were tied, which is just a stunner. I think it is because more of these, I think Democrats became more a party of people of color and of liberals, and I think some of these Southern conservatives especially felt alienated, and Republicans started talking more about issues like immigration, et cetera, that appealed to immigration, crime, that appealed to lower educated white voters, and I think it just slowly shifted over time, so that the numbers are just significantly different than they were a few years ago, and it has continued since the 2020 election. It hasn't slowed down.
Right here in front.
So you said you were having trouble getting Trump voters
I think you're going to speak into it a little louder.
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead, go for it.
You said you were having trouble getting Trump voters to answer your polls. So does this same polling error apply when Trump isn't on the ballot?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the question is, we're having difficulty getting Trump voters on the phone or to answer our surveys. Does it apply even when Trump's not on the ballot? Unfortunately, yeah, it does, because these voters still believe that there's some kind of plot in doing our polling, and that we want to reinforce a point of view, or want to make a point with our surveys, or they're done by the media. They just don't want to answer them. And it's not like, I mean, we can interview more people, and we interview more white, rural, low income. We weight our surveys, but at the same point in time, we don't capture kind of the same essence. We're still not getting those people, and we're not getting them, at least in the numbers they represent when they turn out. That's why you saw in the 20 election, Trump doing better than expected, and our House, we expected to lose 20 seats, 25 seats in the House. We pick up a dozen. That's a huge difference, and that's just, it's not because. It's because the turnout was different than what we had imagined. Trying to figure out who's most likely to vote is crazy when we do our surveys. We ask the question, how likely are you to vote? You know how helpful that question is? 0. I mean, it's like we did a project in Virginia before the governor's race a few years ago. We asked just to get at this question. We asked every kind of turnout question known to man, and then ran it through the data, and then after the election, we went back and looked at the voter rolls for who actually voted. Not a single question was a good predictor of whether somebody's going to vote. 25% of those people who said they were definitely going to vote didn't vote, and 20% of those who said they weren't going to vote did vote. It was like, what the hell? We ended up, the best predictor was whether somebody had voted in the past. So that's the most challenging job I have.
Although in 2016, that turned out not to be such a great predictor in that one, because all these Trump voters who didn't vote came out of the woodwork.
Yeah,
so you never know. Right?
Yeah, higher turnout. I'm all for higher turnout elections, but ask my wife. I'm not good at predicting who winners and losers in these things. We once did everybody does March Madness brackets, right? Well, in our household, we also do election day brackets. I came in 3rd place in our house, so just let me know.
One here, and then, hi, David. Last question will go to you. Again, please stand up. If you
could you
I'm sorry.
tell us about what's going to happen to the Bush, the Romney, the Lamar Alexander, those
the Howard Baker, the Bob Packwood, the Jake Javits, the Cliff Case.
I could not ever understand why Lamar Alexander and Portman, Roy Blunt, Toomey even, would not call Trump out for what he is. Why were they so intimidated? These are presumably.
Well, Bill Frist did. I mean, and then you get the snot kicked out of you, and your persona non grata in your part. I mean, you can do it, but it's you basically martyr yourself, because you're not going to win another election. Not as a Republican. I mean, Mitt Romney, I love the man. I'd walk over hot coals for him. But he can't win a Republican primary for in Iowa or New Hampshire or any place. It's a different time right now. Now, we're going to get through this, and we will eventually, we'll come back around. But again, it's gonna take time. So yeah, I'm not optimistic about. I mean, Rob Portman, what an incredibly good guy, and a quality legislator, and he almost was on the ticket with Mitt. But there's not a future right now in the short term in the party for him. So Bill Graves. We had dinner with Bill Graves the other night. What a wonderful, great governor of Kansas, and he came out the other day and endorsed a Democrat in the state. So it's times are changing.
Okay, last question, David.
When you poll Republicans on their belief in the big lie, the rigging of the election, you get as high as 70% believe that.
I got 59 or so, yeah.
Is there any way you differentiate between those who honestly believe that and those who are simply blind devoted to Donald Trump?
That's a tough one. You know what, we do ask on the survey, on some of our surveys, among Republicans, do you consider yourself to be a Trump Republican or closer to Trump or closer to the Republican Party? And the ones who are closer to Trump are around that 80% number or 70% number that they think the election was stolen. But right now, a majority of Republican primary voters fall into that category. So if,
But correct me if I'm wrong,
No.
I think in your latest work, the share of people in the party who said they're more Trump voters than traditional Republican voters, the Trump voter
the
line is
Trump voter
declining.
numbers are going down, but among Republican primary voters,
Yeah.
it's still enough. I mean, 40% of the Republican primary voters right now, or of Republicans, are diehard Trump supporters. That's enough to win primaries. Yeah. That wins primaries. So, guys, here's the challenge for you in Kansas then. Let's help fix this. Elect good candidates. And for those of you who are students, we have internships. And we'll gladly bring you on, and we'd love to work with some good KU kids.
There you go. Worth the price of admission. And it's a really good firm that Neil helped founded and helps run. Because as I said, we worked with them for years and years. So welcome back to your home state. Thank you for being here very much. We're actually going to dive deep into the Kansas picture next week here, next Wednesday, 4 o'clock, with former Governor Jeff Collier, Republican, and former Congressman Jim Slattery, a Democrat. And as I think you've gotten some sense today, the Kansas political picture is as interesting and important this year as any in the country, I think it's fair to say. So anyway, Neil Newhouse, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here.